It's always a pleasure to be presenting for Morningside Ministries, their mmlearn program. So, what condition makes a person irritable, depressed, self-centered, and is associated with a 29% increase in the risk of premature mortality, early death? What condition? Furthermore, imagine that this condition is found in first world countries, industrialized nations, and that estimates range that maybe a third of the population may suffer from this condition, and maybe 1 in 12 may suffer severely from this condition. Furthermore, imagine that this condition is not protected by income or education or sex or ethnicity. So what condition might this be? The condition of loneliness. Loneliness. Now you'll see the proverb there, Jewish proverb, loneliness breaks the spirit. This is a proverb from a people, from a race, from a tribe that are renowned for their almost unbreakable spirit. But this is an ages-old Jewish proverb. Loneliness breaks our spirit. Who among us hasn't suffered the heartbreak of being homesick? Or maybe the excruciating pain of bereavement? Or the suffering from unrequited love? And maybe at the top of the diamond here, who here, at least transiently or briefly, hasn't felt shunned? These are painful, transient, generally speaking, conditions. But we're going to talk about loneliness. And to begin, we first have to understand this condition. And understanding begins with a definition. So one definition is that loneliness is defined as the discrepancy between a person's desired and actual social relationships. That's somewhat fancy talking. I really want you to think about loneliness as a condition of being disconnected. And in fact, as you can see, this is a condition where a person believes him or herself to be socially isolated, even when among other people. We're all familiar with that poignant phrase, I feel lonely even in a crowded room. So again, that sense of not being connected, not being seen or heard or valued, emotionally disconnected. We've all felt it in our lifetimes on this planet, but generally it's transient. We're talking about chronic loneliness. And it's not the same as being isolated, which at least to social scientists and social psychologists is an objective measure of how many social interactions and relationships one has in a day, in a week, in a month. But if you think about humankind and social species, we require the presence of others. We're born and we're nurtured by parents and by a tribe, and we're protected and we learn skills, because if we didn't develop that way, if we developed as simply rugged individualists, from an evolutionary point of view, survival would have been much more limited. So it's just simply a fact, much as a fact of when we're hungry we have to eat, when we're thirsty we have to drink. The fact is we require the presence of other people who value us, who we can trust, and who we can work together so we can all survive and prosper and care for the next generation so that they can do the same thing. So again, this lack of contact, lack of connection with others, that's at the heart of loneliness. So we have a quotation here from, I believe, Mother Teresa, now a saint. Of course, we know that she worked for decades among the impoverished in India. And what a quote, from particularly from this great woman's perspective. Loneliness and the feeling of being unwanted is the most terrible poverty. So notice she's not talking about income or living space. She's talking about loneliness, and feeling unwanted is the most terrible poverty. So how do we measure loneliness in order to diagnose it? There's a movement afoot now in medicine, and particularly in geriatrics, that loneliness may be a public health epidemic, if you will, untouched, unmeasured. So how do we measure, how do we diagnose loneliness? Luckily, social science has been hard at work, and as you can see, back in 1973, a research instrument was created by Dr. Belcher, the Extended Loneliness Scale. This is pretty lengthy, fairly arduous for a subject to complete, but it opened up the door. And then 20 years later, research scientist in social psychology at UCLA, Dr. John Russell, developed kind of a shorter one-page, 20-question instrument that's very well validated and used commonly in surveys and in studies of loneliness. But we can break that down even a bit more. This is a short 3-question survey that was used in telephone questionnaires to try to get an idea about the prevalence of loneliness. And I think the questions speak volumes, How often do you feel that you lack companionship? How often do you feel left out, shunned? How often do you feel isolated from others? And quite simply, respondents were asked to kind of put these 3 questions into categories of rarely, sometimes, or quite often. And as you might imagine, maximizing those scores on these 3 questions validates pretty closely with those long questionnaires. So we have a scale, we have instruments to actually measure loneliness. But now we have a quote from Anna Nagel. I had to look her up. She was the most popular British film star in 1942. And remember, 1942 was, Britain was at war. It was the London Blitz. There was a tremendous demoralization, and this gal was sort of a shining beacon. And here's this incredibly popular movie star during a very severe time, and her quotation again speaks volumes. Solitude is pleasant, loneliness is not. They're very different acts. So this isn't about people that seek solitude. This is about folks that have chronic loneliness. And how prevalent is it worldwide? How common is this condition that's associated with premature mortality? Well, surveys and studies in the United States suggest the following. These are just statistical data from epidemiologic surveys. And the first one is really kind of heartbreaking. Even at a young age, surveys suggest maybe 8 to 12% of children from kindergarten to sixth grade are chronically lonely. And just sort of touching the surface here, 7% of adults endorse intense or persistent loneliness on the instruments that we earlier presented. And then as we age, this becomes more prevalent. 20% of adults older than 65 report feeling lonely much of the previous week. And 32% of folks over 55 feel lonely at any given time. But let's continue. There's pretty good evidence that as we age, loneliness increases on some level. You know, we lose our life's partner, we lose our relatives, perhaps we lose our workmates through retirement, perhaps through illness and being sedentary, we lose our social connections. So it stands to reason that as we age, the likelihood of this condition goes up. And the paradox is, here we are living in a digital age. You know, this is the most technologically connected mankind has ever been. But are we really connected? I mean, is Facebook the same thing as sitting with someone who can see you, who can value you, who can actually hear you? So there's accumulating evidence that even though we're more connected than ever before, rates of loneliness are only increasing and skyrocketing. I think the fact at the bottom of this slide really hits home, particularly with older folks. You know, I actually think that's a gross underestimate. 200,000 older people have not had a conversation with friends or family for 30 straight days. Good Lord, here we are digitally connected. How difficult is it to pick up the device and contact someone? Some additional risk factors. I have a bit of an error in that opening bullet. Loneliness is an equal opportunity affliction. By that I meant there's not significant differences between sex or income or education. But it is, as I mentioned earlier, more prevalent as we age. Nor is loneliness associated with eccentricities or peculiarities in folks. It's not only the shy people or the lifelong loner who's chronically lonely. In fact, that's probably a great myth. There's mounting evidence that people that suffer from loneliness are ordinary people, and they've developed this condition. And how might we develop it? Well, some thoughts are we now are living in an age where marriage is delayed. We're living in an age where perhaps partners have dual careers. They're frantically busy. When they are done with their work, they perhaps take it home, and then they just collapse, and there's no time or attention to be connected. It's a fascinating demographic about the logarithmic increase in single residence households in the United States. Before 1970, they were less than 15%. Between 1970 and 1990, it went up to 20%. 1990 to 2000, 25%. These are single resident households in the United States. And I don't know what the next census will bring us. And then last but not least, you know, this may sound a little unusual, but reduced fertility rates. Another little piece at the bottom, 4 million older people agree that the television set is the main form of their company, of their social connectedness. So, we have a lovely quote by Norman Cousins. You might remember Norman Cousins. He wrote kind of a landmark biography, if you will, in the 1980s called Anatomy of an Illness. And he was diagnosed at that time with what was thought to be an incurable, very painful illness called ankylosing spondylitis. And when he was diagnosed, no treatment existed. So he decided to treat himself, and he did this through a variety of treatments, but many of these treatments involve the company and the pleasure of his friends and family being around him, being socially connected. So here we have Norman Cousins kind of making a statement that the eternal quest from birth to death of a human being is to try to shatter being lonely. So what's the effect of loneliness on our health? How can it possibly lead to earlier death, premature mortality? We've got a boatload of data on effects of loneliness on our physical health, and we can condense it to just a phrase. Right now, the current belief from social scientists working hand in hand with medicine is that the effects of chronic loneliness on humankind is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I'll put it in another context. If you look at the effects of air pollution on shortening our life, it's about 5%. And the effects of obesity, about 15%. Effects of alcoholism, about 20%. And the effects of loneliness, 29 to 45%. So one of the premier researchers in social psychology out of the University of Chicago, Dr. John Capaccio, he's made the declaration that loneliness has surprisingly broad and profound effects on our health, physically and mentally. And we've got precise data in both animal studies and in human studies that subjects with chronic loneliness have increased vascular resistance, which of course leads to elevated blood pressure, that their sleep is worse, they have microarousals, disturbed sleep architecture, their immune system is diminished, their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, the HPA axis, is dysregulated. And quite simply, the HPA axis is what we use for fly or fight responses. Long story short, folks that have chronic loneliness are hypervigilant to threats that don't exist. Furthermore, there's pretty good evidence that chronic loneliness leads to reduction in anti-inflammatory activity and an increase in abnormal circulating white cells. So this is all just in the physical domain. Dr. Capaccio makes the quotation that people who need social connections, who are chronically lonely, should think about being alone in the same way a person with high blood pressure thinks about salt. In other words, make efforts to avoid salt, make efforts to be connected, to avoid continuing loneliness. This one's eye-popping. Again, in the physical domain, there's strong evidence looking at heart surgery patients and those that have strong social networks, that have very low scores on the UCLA loneliness score, and furthermore that have spiritual practices. And remember, spiritual practices are coming together with others in a regular way, a ritualistic way, a way that we're anchored. And when we look at these patients that undergo heart surgery, those folks that are connected very well with strong social support networks and have very grounded spiritual practices, they have one-seventh the mortality of patients that don't have those two things. And what about mental health? Again, good evidence now, or emerging evidence, that chronic loneliness increases the risk, maybe even the velocity of cognitive decline, and essentially the progression of Alzheimer's dementia. When we look at different groups, particularly groups that kind of see their future as alone, they have decreased executive functioning versus groups that say, I don't see my future being alone. We think that the impairment in executive functioning is because people that are chronically lonely, they're much more hypervigilant to social threats because they're alone. If we go back to evolution, when we're alone, we're more vigilant to predators because we're by ourselves. We don't have a tribe. We don't have people that we know and trust around us. And then last but not least, it kind of goes with the territory, doesn't it? Chronic loneliness, increased depression, increased suicidal ideation, increased behavior. Of course, right now, we are preoccupied with gun violence, and how often do we hear, sort of as an aside, this person was a loner, not connected. So this quote is from an author. She wrote this terrific text that I'd recommend to everybody called The Happiness Project. So I think her quote goes directly to what we're thinking about today, which is even though loneliness affects so many of us, it hasn't gotten much attention compared to related conditions like depression or anxiety. They really get the lion's share of the spotlight, but that's beginning to change. So what's the biology of chronic loneliness look like? We know a little bit about it. We're able to put folks that have high scores on those loneliness scales and that endorse chronic loneliness, feeling disconnected, being alone in a crowd, we're able to put them into functional brain imaging machines, devices, the fMRI, and we're able to look at different parts of the brain. And quite simply, folks that suffer from chronic loneliness, their brains are different, okay? We look at a part of the brain called the ventral striatum, and this is connected to reward and pleasure sites. And in subjects with chronic loneliness, this area is less likely to be activated with reward. Furthermore, the parts of our brain, in particular the amygdala, this is in our deep brain, and we know that this is the fear circuit, if you will, for flight or fight. And this is on high activation. Subjects with chronic loneliness, their reward circuitry is downregulated, their fear circuitry is upregulated. And because of this, we think that this affects, what we call executive control and restraint, because we're kind of always worried about threat. We're not able to take a breath mentally and look at, higher levels of thinking, the high road, if you will. So, how can this be? Maybe, this is all theoretically, but maybe loneliness has an adaptive purpose. It motivates being reconnected with others, being reconnected with the tribe that can protect us. So it's unpleasant for us because if it wasn't unpleasant, then guess what? The tribe wouldn't survive. Everyone would fragment into individuals. Another kind of different way to view it is maybe this is a lot like physical pain, and Physical pain tells us we have tissue damage, and we need to pay attention to that area. We need to try to repair it, rest it, relieve that pain. So perhaps loneliness is sort of that same type of signal, if you will. And, we want to alleviate this social pain and seek out connections so that we can feel secure, safe, and content with life. So given what we know, what we've heard about the condition and how we might go about diagnosing it, how common it is, its effects on physical and mental health, even the biology of loneliness, what can we do about it? What can we do about it? So maybe the first thing is recognizing it, not denying it. Quite often I think we tend to stigmatize loneliness. That's somebody who's a loser or who's terminally shy, always have been that way. So just simply recognizing. And then I think the second piece is, trying to understand it, understand the biology of it, understand the mechanisms of it, and then lastly to take action. Take action individually, take action socially, across the board. And it's things that seem intuitive, improve social skills. But how do we do that to someone who's alone, who's not connected? How do we improve their social skills? Enhancing social support. It's a wonderful catchphrase, but again, how do we connect with people? Increasing opportunities for social contact. And then lastly, how do we, change how this came to be? How do we reverse engines, if you will? So, on the surface, improving social skills. So, for those of you that are familiar with the blue zones in the world, where people live longer, live healthier than any other places on the planet, when we examine the blue zones, what we find out is the common denominator in these 5 blue zones is that these folks in these areas, they prioritize social connectedness with families, with spirituality. They have established rituals and established anchors where this isn't a rare event. We're all going to come together for Thanksgiving dinner. This is a 3 times a day event where we're meeting at meals, where we're sharing stories, we're sharing positive moments, we're improving our social skills. So here's a lovely picture, I presume at an assisted living facility, where it looks like a younger facilitator is working with 5 elderly folks, and they're playing a kind of a group game of Scrabble. So what's going on at this point? Well, I'd like to believe what's going on is these folks, for this moment, for this hour, they're connected. And the reason they've agreed to play with each other is that they trust them. And maybe they value them. Okay? And we've even got someone that's kind of leading the team there. What about enhancing social support? So here's a picture that has 1,000 words, right? Because first off, we look at these folks and they're all in a wheelchair, but they're out. I'm fantasizing that they're watching maybe a play put on by little children, or maybe they're listening to a concert in the park, okay? But they're all together, even though they're physically limited. They're all together, and they're all tuned in, okay? They aren't watching this on their device alone in their room, okay? They're connected. And then last one, maybe this is my favorite picture of all, because I think we all immediately recognize the famous, the legendary Meals on Wheels. And again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. 1,000 words. Maybe it's worth 1,000 words. Look at the smiles here. Not just the recipient, but the bearer, okay? So for those of you that have participated in Meals on Wheels, you know that when you ring that doorbell, you might be the only contact that person has had all day. Or perhaps if they've never had this, all week, all month, all year. So how can we increase opportunities for social contact? And then the last one, this is again more from the research from social sciences and social psychology, which is what they think might be the most potent treatment option for loneliness is at least looking at meta-analysis, looking at study after study, what seems to be the most effective, has the greatest effect size and the best chances, cognitive behavioral therapy. Because it kind of attacks the loop of loneliness. You know, we know that subjects with chronic loneliness are much more sensitive. They're always on the lookout for social threats. They zero in on negative social information and close out on positive social information. They remember negative aspects of social events, not the positive aspects. And they hold much greater negative social expectations. And then they behave in ways that confirm that. So in CBT, the therapist is slowly, carefully trying to reverse that whole process. Can we not just zero in on the negative? For a moment, can you relax your worry about threat? Can you focus on something that made you laugh or that felt good? But as you might guess, CBT takes time, and we have to bring that person to the therapist. We have to have a connection there. So while it's got a great effect, it's not easily done. So let's look at some takeaways. If you hold that chronic loneliness at its heart is being disconnected from others, not being seen or heard or valued or being able to feel that you can trust anyone else, that social connections would obviously be powerful, very helpful. Religious, spiritual congregations, service organizations, of which there's just an endless plethora, charity work, continuing adult education, clubs and social organizations. Obviously, these are right off the bat very helpful in warding off loneliness. But how about on an individual basis? How about trying to discover, that's a hard thing, and cultivate confidence? If you step back and ask yourself, how many confidants do I have in my life? I hope everyone listening to this has at least one, but I hope you have maybe 4 or 5 or 10. Imagine the wonder for someone who's chronically lonely of having just one person that they can know and trust and who offers them unconditional support. Talk about a powerful medicine. How about making social connections in the workplace? Typically that's somewhat frowned upon. We're in a very productive, industrialized society. The busier we are, the more valued we are. So it's interesting, a number of workplaces have started a process called the inside scoop, which means once a week, usually at a group meeting, the team, one member of the team, has 5 minutes, just a short 5 minutes, but they have to bring pictures and tell a story about something positive in their life. And each week it rotates to a different team member. That's just 5 minutes in a full work week, okay? But imagine what that's like. You get to listen to someone else tell you about a positive part about their life, and you're getting connected with them, and when your turn comes up, you're going to try and do the same for them that they did for you. How about making ourselves available? Easier said than done, particularly with, maybe this message goes to the millennial audience or Generation Z, headphones off. Look up or away from the phone. Say hello to everybody that you meet today. Consider a digital cleanse, which is terrifying on the surface, but just think about it, because it's offering, I think, a different, more intimate, deeper type of connection. And then lastly, we can take a lot of help from our former empire, of which we were a colony, the United Kingdom. They're quite far along at looking at loneliness. As you know, in 2014, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, she appointed for the United Kingdom a minister of loneliness, akin to our, Health and Human Services Director in the United States. So they have a number of programs aimed at targeting loneliness. They have something called a Silver Line. It's a helpline for older people in the UK where they can call and speak to a live human being for as long as they want, 24/7, 365 days a year. And this service averages 10,000 calls a week. The UK also has another program called Age Up, where they go to great lengths to try and create social events for older people. So perhaps we can begin to take away some of the benefits that have already been created in the United Kingdom. So thank you for your attention.